I've been on this diet for 6 months, and I went on it because my mother is diabetic, and she was diagnosed in the early 60s, and my grandmother was diabetic, and I figured that I'm next in line to be diabetic, and I'm not diabetic, but I don't want to become type 2 diabetes, so I started getting interested in this LCHF and decided to take it on. And the first thing that happened was I lost weight, my exercising improved, and that got me started on this whole journey, really, a journey of discovery. So I'm a trusting person. I trust what I've been taught is true. I trust that people are basically good and mean me no harm. I trust that my education has equipped me to make healthy decisions. I trust that the food I buy is safe to eat, and I trust that what is sold as food is healthy. And but what if everything I've learned is not true? What if there are people who care more about profit than about my welfare? What if common sense is based on false information? And what if a flawed education leads me to make unhealthy decisions? And what if the food I buy is actually making me ill? So if we look at the trends in obesity, obesity is out of control. Since the 1980s, you can see that there's this exponential rise in obesity. It's not only in the United States, it's all over the world. We see USA, Australia, Canada, England, Spain. Not only adults, it's also in children. We see, we're out of Generation X and we're into Generation 3 extra large. Things are getting out of hand. Not only with obesity, but that's led to an increase in diabetes as well. And we see that since the 1980s, diabetes has gone way, way up. So not only is our society more sick, but the society is costing us more and more money. And it's going to cost us taxpayers more and more as we go along. And in the States, they've done research, and they found that they predict that by 2026, that's only 11 years' time, the Obamacare and the rest of the welfare will be bankrupt, and it will all go on diabetes and obesity care. So Ebola, which everyone was so worried about, is cut down. It's small compared to all the other things that are going along. So how did we get into this mess? One of the first people who looked into it was actually a journalist. His name's Gary Tao, and during the 10-year that I showed, he went into how we got to this, and he looked at the established truths, like a calories in equals calories out, and this basically means that a calorie is a calorie, and he showed that this is not true. He said that he showed that what the belief that obesity is due to increased intake, decreased exercise is not totally true, and obesity is a result of our plentiful society, meaning that we're becoming lazier and eating more. That means that we're becoming, that's what's called the fat, lazy slob theory. And he set out to disprove that. He disproved it by showing a few things. He showed that hard-working societies, where they go out like these pickers, they're poor but they're hard-working, they burn a lot of energy, but they still have a high rate of obesity. And even if one's meticulous in counting calories in, calories out, and is able to balance it over the years, obesity to some people is absolutely inevitable. And if you think that animals maintain a constant body weight over the years, the one thing they definitely don't do is count calories. He looked at primitive societies and showed how when they were primitive and hunter-gatherers, they were thin and slim, and when they became westernized and having a Western diet, they very soon became obese and overweight like the rest of the Western world. And he showed that there is such a thing as an insulin roller coaster. We know that when we eat any kind of carbohydrate, any kind of food even, one's blood glucose goes up, the insulin goes up in order to match it. It drives the sugar down. One drops below a certain level, one gets this sugar craving, otherwise known as hunger. And by mid-morning tea, one's ready for a little bit of a boost, a couple of cookies, some tea, and that gets you through to lunch. At lunch, you eat a bigger meal, you boost your sugar right up, your insulin comes right behind, drives that sugar down, you have that sugar craving again, you're ready for afternoon tea. And so it goes on. And we call that the insulin roller coaster. And the question is how to get off of that. Insulin basically drives glucose into the fat cells and muscles. It helps build protein and it induces glycogen storage. Glycogen is like plant starch, that's animal starch, that's kept in the muscles and kept in the fats in the liver for further use. What insulin also does is it's a cellular lock-in. It locks in fat, glycogen, and fat cells gets fatter, and it doesn't release the energy in order to be used. So the overall message of insulin is storage, and that's what insulin does.
So if you just go conclusions, biology, again, it's biology, it's not a physics thing. So obesity is sort of fat accumulation, not energy balance, not overeating and sedentary behavior. Fat accumulation is regulated fundamentally by insulin and dietary carbohydrates. Carbohydrate driving insulin is driving fat. And the only non-pharmaceutical remedy, of which we have none, is to remove the carbohydrates.
Right, so that in a synopsis is what he found. The next person to come along was Nina Teitholz, and she was also a journalist. She got into this because her first assignment was as a restaurant critic, and she was served all these fatty meals with lots of meat and whatever they served up she ate, and some of those pounds which were hard to get off started going off, and she decided to look into these myths of the fat hypothesis. So she looked into that, and she looked into the fact that said fat makes you fat, dietary fat causes obesity, and dietary fat causes heart disease. And she traced this whole concept back to one man, Ansel Keys.
It strikes without warning. Of 10 men, we can expect 5 to get it. But we can't say who, or when, or why.
When the war ended, Ansel Keys turned his scientific curiosity toward the new American plague, as he called it, coronary heart disease.
The facts are simple. You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels. Here are vital statistics. They show that this problem here in America is the worst in the world.
In the 1950s, a biochemist named Ansel Keys published a study that compared heart disease and fat consumption in a half-dozen countries. The more fat, the more heart disease. The trend line was unmistakable. Just one little problem. Keys left out countries where people eat a lot of fat but have very little heart disease, like Holland and Norway. He also left out countries where people don't eat much fat but do have a lot of heart disease, like Chile. In fact, Keys had reliable data from 22 countries, and the results were all over the place. But you can't make a big splash in the scientific community with a trend line that looks like this. So Keys did what any dedicated researcher would do. He threw out the data that didn't fit and published his results. His punishment for this bit of scientific chicanery was to get his picture on the cover of Time magazine. Keys became known as the father of the lipid hypothesis, which says that eating saturated fat raises the cholesterol in your blood, and high cholesterol in your blood clogs your arteries and causes heart disease.
This whole idea that dietary fat causes cholesterol problems is sort of a myth. The whole idea that cholesterol problems lead to heart disease is a myth. It's become part of the zeitgeist. Everybody knows saturated fat is bad for you, but when you get back and you start looking at the medical literature and you root back through to find out where this whole idea came from, it's bogus.
Then we fast forward to 1977 with the McGovern report. As Shelley mentioned, things were going bad. There was increasing heart disease. We didn't seem to be getting on top of it. So they commissioned Senator George McGovern in 1977 to look into the diet which would best serve the Americans to lower heart disease. And somehow this his mandate got extended to all Americans.
The committee's original report urged Americans to reduce their risk of heart attacks by reducing their intake of cholesterol down to the equivalent of about 1 egg a day.
You know, there were eminent scientists of the time saying this is nonsense. There is no good scientific evidence that either fat or cholesterol, is at the root of heart disease.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
The McGovern Committee's report was written by a young staff member who happened to be a vegetarian and had no background in medicine or health research. The committee recommended a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet for everyone. Thanks to a handful of politicians with no background in science, the heart-healthy benefits of a low-fat diet became official government policy. And real scientists got the message loud and clear. Tell us what we already believe, or you can say goodbye to your lucrative government funding.
Government policy was basically to dictate the direction of research for the next 10 to 20 years. But if we look at new science as it emerged, we come by 1994 where Jeffrey Friedman, who is a doctor and a geneticist at Rockefeller University, he discovered leptin. Now leptin is the hormone of weight regulation. We eat, we produce insulin, that drives sugar into the fat cells, we know that, and the fat cells produce a substance called leptin. The leptin is then seen by the brain, and a negative feedback path is created where we stop eating, lose our appetite, and start exercising to burn stuff off. And you know that anyone who's got small children and you give them lollipops and sugar, very soon they get a sugar high and they certainly don't want to eat their dinner. And what happens with starvation? Now this is why calorie-restricted diet is doomed to failure. And we've all been on them, call them the yo-yo diets. You're on, you're off, you're up, you're down. And what happens is that you lose fat cells. Your fat cells shrink. The fat cells are the things that produce the leptin. When the leptin goes down, the brain perceives this as starvation. So it starts slowing you down and making you eat more. So you can control yourself for just so long, and then somehow you just go off that diet and you regain everything that you've lost. So leptin controls appetite and it ensures caloric balance is maintained. And unless something comes to disrupt functioning of leptin, it all works very well. So the question is, can leptin become invisible? That is, invisible to the brain. Is there something in nature that turns fat storage on or off? So we have a researcher, his name is Dr. Richard J. Johnson from Colorado, Denver, and he looked into something called the fat switch. And he did this by studying hibernating animals. He studied actually little cute little squirrels, and they store fat in the autumn, and during the winter they accumulate fat for the use, and during the winter they use their fat and they survive. Now if you were to take a hibernating bear or squirrel or anything and you shake them awake, you'll find that they will wake, and you present them with food, but they won't eat, because they're in a fat metabolizing phase and not a fat accumulating phase. So how does it all start? So he looked at squirrels in conditions of starvation, and he showed that there was a rise in uric acid. And he reasoned that in diabetes there also is a rise in uric acid. So he looked into what makes uric acid rise, and he found out there's something in the AMP metabolism. Now I apologize, there is a little bit of biochemistry here and a little bit of science, but AMP is involved in the energy pathway, and it can be metabolized by one of two enzymes, AMP kinase and AMP deaminase. And AMP deaminase happens to also, as a side product, produce uric acid. And AMP deaminase creates a storage of energy, so you have fat storage, which goes to triglycerides and fat. And if AMP is activated, you have fat burning and AMP production. So just keep that in mind when you see what...
We have a paper that's under review where we then looked at hibernating animals, and we found that AMPD gets activated in the summer in these hibernating squirrels, and they accumulate fat. And we've now recently shown that this stimulates gluconeogenesis too, so it's actually stimulating glucose production. And then when in winter, they switch over and they activate AMPK, and then they start burning the glucose and burning the fat. Now the reason this is important for a low-carb conference is that the best stimulator of AMPD is fructose, which is in sugar. It is just a terrific way to activate the fat accumulation phase. What activates AMPD in humans? We believe sugar is the primary culprit, and in the U.S., high fructose corn syrup, and we think it's fructose that does it. Actually, we know fructose activates AMPD, and fructose does so by consuming ATP. It breaks down to AMP, and as intracellular phosphate falls, it activates this enzyme. And so when we give fructose to animals, we actually induce leptin resistance. They accumulate, they lose their ability to control their appetite, their activity falls, their fat mass goes up, they activate AMPD. So we now think that fructose is a big player in the stimulation of weight gain, and that it may do so through this pathway.
So animals during the autumn, they consume vast amounts of fruit. Bears will eat these berries. They can eat up to 10,000 berries a day. Squirrels will eat their nuts and acorns. Migrating birds will eat also various fruits, and that will keep them going for around the world flight. And this is actually a very good thing. In animals, it's very important for survival to get through the winter, and in humans, in our past, that's been very important as well, because the fruit comes but once a year. You're either there or you're not. When you gorge on those fruit, you manage to store a lot of fat, and it's going to get you through some very tough months, 4 or 5 months of snow and no fruit and very little game, and it's a matter of survival to store up energy. So if we remember what I told you about leptin, we eat, we produce insulin, the leptin is produced, it's seen by the brain, there's a negative feedback which makes us stop eating and exercise. But what if there's actually a blockage? And we believe that fructose, and some believe that insulin itself is high levels of insulin is a block for leptin. In other words, the brain won't see all that leptin. Now we know that obese people actually have a lot of leptin. They have tons of leptin. It's not that they can't produce leptin, but the brain can't see the leptin. So it perceives itself as being in starvation. That causes hunger. We're back to eat. More insulin, more fructose and insulin which causes the block, and it becomes a positive feedback cycle which starts driving obesity. Now, could sugar be the driving force for the obesity epidemic? So if we look at sugar sales throughout the world, we can trace it back to the 1700s, and we see that in the 1700s it was available to some, but only the very rich. And some of those very rich were also very obese. The two dips we see are World War I and World War II, but basically sugar has become cheaper and more available. And the black lines at the end are high fructose corn syrup, which is available in the States mostly. We see that the rate of diabetes on the right is rising, and the death from diabetes is starting to rise, and that came about as the rate of sugar consumption rose. So we could also ask, as we've been told, that fats may be causing this obesity epidemic. Well, does it bear out in the fats? Is butter driving the obesity epidemic? So if we look at sales of butter, we see that since 1939, start of the First World War, butter sales have plummeted. What went up in the Second World War are margarine sales, and since we know about trans fats, those have also come down. But we can see that butter and fats cannot be driving the obesity epidemic. So maybe it's meat. Maybe we've become bigger meat eaters, and meat is driving the obesity epidemic. So let's look at meat sales throughout the world, and we see that meat sales have actually gone down as the obesity epidemic have gone up. So it looks like sugar is a big factor. Now, where I mentioned before that the fruit falls and you either eat it or you lose it, use it or lose it, we now have fruit available all year round. So seasonal fruits are now on our shelves year round, and we can have as much of that as we want. And if you look at this is some of the things that we find in our supermarket, every single thing is spiked with sugar. And it's spiked with sugar on purpose. And it's spiked with sugar because sugar makes it taste good. And sugar makes us want to eat more. And that's going to cause people to buy more. And the food industry is just cashing in. They've cut the fat raise the sugar, raise the salt, and we're just loving it. So, I'd like to now just tell you a little bit about the story of cholesterol, because this is also important, because one of those hypotheses was that cholesterol is causing heart disease, the cholesterol we eat. So I brought in someone to help me. His name is Dr. Ken Sikaris from Melbourne, and he explains the biochemical model of cholesterol and lipodysgenesis, as it's called. So he shows that high fructose intake is transported to the liver, and it goes into fat production in the liver, and fat is exported as triglycerides into the blood. It interacts with the HDL, it makes the HDL decrease. The LDL is altered by these high triglycerides. It forms something called small dense LDL particles, and it's these small dense LDL particles which are involved in atherosclerosis, and we see that these LDLs are raised, and that's what we call bad cholesterol. So just bear with me. It's very interesting the way he explains it, much better than I could. So there it is.
So what will the liver do with it? What does the liver do with all this fructose and glucose? Part of the important part is because you're taking it with glucose, you're making insulin. And insulin tells the liver, don't worry, there's plenty of glucose around. If you see any fructose, make it into fat. When you eat fructose and glucose, all the fructose becomes fat in the liver. And here's a study in some mice fed fructose. This is their liver. Normally liver is dark and hard, and after a couple of weeks there's some white dots appearing. That's fat stores. After 4 weeks there's more fat, and by the time they've been fed fructose for a couple of months, their liver is full of fat. That's what fatty liver is in animals, and that's what fatty liver is in humans. If you eat fructose for months, you will have a fatty liver. But the other thing the fat is, it has to get out of the liver. It gets out of it by going into the blood. So your blood is full of fat, triglycerides. Let's have a look what happens to good and bad cholesterol when there's all this triglyceride particle there. The triglyceride particle will take cholesterol out of HDL and move triglyceride in it. There's a transport protein that just swaps it around. The end result of all this swapping around between HDL and triglyceride-rich particle is that HDL disappears. You lose your good cholesterol when there's this triglyceride-rich, the fat particle coming out of the liver. The second thing that happens is that the VLDL interacts with the bad cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, and it starts pulling out cholesterol ester, putting in triglyceride, but what you end up with is this small hard VLDL particle. And that small hard VLDL particle is no longer a useful thing for the body. The body doesn't know what to do with it. And small dense LDL, which you see when the triglycerides are high, when fat levels are high, small dense LDL is what gets into your blood vessels. LDL doesn't get into the blood vessels unless you've changed it in some serious way. And fat is the way to really change LDL into this very dangerous small dense LDL. So 30 years ago we used to say, oh, you know, you want to work out your lipid fats. If your cholesterol's high, you need to do something. Any doctor that's practicing that medicine, just looking at the cholesterol level, is 30 years out of date. Now, you may have thought you were pretty clever saying good and bad cholesterol. That's 20 years out of date. We've known about that for 20 years, and that's not the whole story either. 10 years ago, we realised that if you change the LDL particle, which we call bad cholesterol, it's actually good. We need that LDL particle. We need cholesterol going around the body. We need it for lots of things, hormones, membranes. But if you change that particle in any way, by oxidising it, by adding sugar to it, or by making it small and dense, that's what causes heart disease. And so now, today, the way of thinking, the focus has shifted completely from cholesterol to triglyceride. because it's triglyceride what makes bad cholesterol really bad.
And what about this atherosclerosis? The atherosclerosis comes as a result of inflammation, and inflammation is causes damage to the epithelial cells of the arteries, and LDL comes by to patch it up. It was like a band-aid, and it patches up the damage, and the artery recovers, because that's the functioning of LDL. But the small, dense LDL, that's what enters the artery wall. It becomes oxidized, it attracts white blood cells, and that's how atherosclerosis develops. So I've got someone else to help me.
And what the recent research is showing is the heart disease does not begin because your cholesterol goes up. Heart disease begins when your coronary arteries become damaged or inflamed. When that happens, LDL cholesterol will show up to try to repair the damage. Why? Because that is exactly what LDL cholesterol is supposed to do. It is an important part of your body's repair system. Unfortunately, LDL cholesterol comes in different sized packages. It can be large and fluffy, or it can be small and dense. Large, fluffy cholesterol is not harmless. In fact, it appears to have antiviral and anti-inflammatory properties. Small, dense cholesterol can be a problem, because if small, dense cholesterol shows up to repair your arteries, it can slip into the wall of the artery and get stuck there. And when that happens, it will become rancid, it will oxidize, it will start to attract white blood cells, which will also get stuck back there. That is how you start getting a plaque to build up, and that is how you end up with heart disease. It has nothing to do with how much cholesterol is in your body. It has to do with what kind of cholesterol you're making. And that's why Dwight Eisenhower, with cholesterol of 165, could develop heart disease. So let's look at what might be driving heart disease. We said it starts with inflammation. What causes inflammation? Three biggest sources: smoking, elevated blood sugar, emotional stress.
I'd like to tell you about the hormonal model of obesity, something that's been expounded as well. There's a genetic condition called insulin resistance. When you have a high carbohydrate diet, if you have insulin resistance, the insulin causes fat storage, and that decreases physical activity, we've shown, and it increases the high density LDL. You raise your uric acid, which leads to this cluster called the metabolic syndrome, which is obesity, type 2 diabetes, gout, coronary artery disease, and more difficulty exercising. And the answer to that is to cut the carbs. Same conclusion: fat does not make you fat. That means dietary fat does not make you fat, nor does it cause heart disease. Carbohydrates cause weight gain by stimulating insulin to accumulate fat. Carbohydrates cause the bad small LDL, and the sugar is what's driving the epidemic of obesity. And the conclusion is to decrease the insulin, and we do that by cutting carbs. So keep carbs, and we're going to reboot everything. And how do we reboot? We reboot your system by keeping your insulin down. And how do we keep the insulin down? You need to cut carbs and boost fat, and hence we get the low-carb, high-fat diet. So if we look at the three macronutrients that we have in our diet, we have carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And if you look at the plasma insulin on your left, a glucose tolerance test, all pregnant women have been through that, where you have to drink 50 or 100 grams of glucose, and it spikes up your glucose very high, your glucose in your blood, and that causes a rise in insulin. When you eat protein, it also rises, but less so. But fat almost is not triggered by, or insulin is not triggered by your fat intake. So that's very important in the theory behind why the low-carb, high-fat diet works. And if we look at the things which you can eat, there are three lists which I've distributed to people. We call it the green, orange, and red list after the traffic lights. The green, you can eat almost unlimited amounts. Fats, things like cheese, olive oil, animal fats, butter. You can eat meat, fish, eggs, almost unlimited. We have avocados there. Green vegetables, green leafy vegetables, what have you. Things that you can eat less in limited quantities are various fruits, and some vegetables are on the orange list. On the red list, which you should avoid altogether, are things like carbohydrates, sweets, and I must mention omega-6 rich oils, which includes canola oil, sunflower seed oil, cottonseed oil, all the seed oils. And those are almost toxic to us because they're very rich in omega-6. They create an imbalance in our metabolism. Now, you may well say, is this a fad diet? Well, I came across this cookery book, which was written, as you see, copyrighted in 1917. Now, if I remind you, 1917 is before the discovery of insulin. That happened by Banting and Best. Banting was a doctor. Charles Best was a medical student. 1921, they discovered insulin in Toronto with research into dogs. And since then, we've known all about insulin. So this was even 1917, before insulin was discovered. But they inherently knew that the way to keep diabetes under control was to eat one of three. They had these three tables. And as you see, the table number 1, where you can eat freely under direction, you have beef, lamb, veal, you have things like duck, you have beef, various cured and smoked fish, fresh fish, vegetables and fats, and very similar to the list that I've been handing out. We have 2 more lists, the orange list which I talk about. That says table number 2, foods that we eat moderately, and occasionally things like apples, apricots, figs, lemons, peaches, etc. Vegetables, they're those vegetables that store up their carbohydrates. You must be careful with those too. Things like potatoes, carrots, other things. On the red list, things to avoid, says table number 4, foods strictly forbidden: sugar, beets, pies, puddings, flour, bread, biscuits, rice, barley. Most of the things that we see on our list that I've been handing out to my patients. And when you're on a low-carb, high-fat diet, these are the changes that you can expect. If 0 is your starting point, in comparing calorie-restricted diets, the Mediterranean diet, and a full low-carb, high-fat diet, you can expect your weight to go down. And some of the research actually was done in Israel, in Dimona, by a team from Soroka, and this bears out to what they found as well. The HbA1c, which is a measurement of diabetes, goes way down, glucose goes down, total carbohydrates goes down. Your LDL may go up, but it's your good LDL and not that small dense LDL. Your HDL, which is the good cholesterol, goes up, and your triglycerides, which Dr. Serkius told us is the most sensitive indicator of bad cholesterol, that goes way down, and more than any other diet that was tested. So LCHF diet is sustainable. One gets satisfied quicker at each meal, and one becomes more satisfied for a longer time. The high fat makes delicious meals. I always quote to my patients, and many of you have heard it, that for lunch I have a healthy salad with olive oil, and then I make a 3-egg omelette fried in butter and filled with 30% cheese, and it's delicious. And after one becomes adapted and what's called a fat metabolizer, one can have higher sports endurance because one has a plug into all one's stored fat, which otherwise one would not have the ability to mobilize, and it becomes effortless to control one's body weight. So we've got to get away from that food pyramid, which we've been told about, and get onto this healthy food pyramid, which we know about since the 1900s, and what we should all be on to cure our overweight. Thank you.